At my cousin's wedding, my aunt pointed at me and said, "Don't get too comfortable. This family will never respect you." Everyone laughed, until the bride's father stood up, looked straight at her, and revealed a secret that made half the room walk out. I, 32M, never wanted to go to that wedding. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for weeks, mocking me every morning while I made coffee. My cousin was getting married to someone I'd never met, and the whole affair was being held at some overpriced hotel ballroom 2 hours from my apartment. But Mom had called 3 times, each conversation more insistent than the last, reminding me that family was family and that my absence would be noticed and judged. So I went. The ceremony itself was fine. Standard vows, predictable tears from the mothers, a flower girl who wouldn't stop spinning. I sat in the back, planning my escape route for right after dinner. The reception hall was decorated in that generic, elegant style that costs a fortune but looks like every other wedding. Round tables with white cloths, centerpieces with roses and baby's breath, strings of lights that were supposed to look romantic but just made everything slightly harder to see. I found my assigned table. Table 7. Far enough from the main action that I knew exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. My aunt was already seated there, the one who'd made it her life's mission to remind me at every family gathering that I was somehow lesser. She'd raised 3 successful kids, she never tired of mentioning. Meanwhile, I dropped out of my graduate program 5 years ago and now worked as a freelance graphic designer, which she treated as code for unemployed. The meal service started, and I focused on my plate, trying to become invisible. That strategy had worked at the last 2 family gatherings. But tonight felt different. The wine was flowing more freely than usual, and I could feel my aunt's attention shifting toward me like a predator spotting wounded prey. It happened during the lull between the main course and dessert. The DJ was taking a break, and the room had settled into that comfortable buzz of conversation and clinking glasses. My aunt's voice cut through it all, loud and clear, aimed directly at me from across the table. She told me not to get too comfortable, that this family would never respect me. The words landed like a slap. The conversations around our table stopped. People turned to look. And then, horribly, someone laughed. Then another person joined in. Within seconds, half the table was chuckling, as if she'd made some hilarious observation instead of publicly humiliating me at a family wedding. I felt my face burning. My hands gripped my napkin under the table, knuckles white. I'd spent 32 years developing a thick skin when it came to her comments. But something about the public nature of this one, the casual cruelty delivered in front of extended family and strangers, made my throat tight. I was formulating some weak response when movement caught my eye. The bride's father was standing up at the head table. He was a tall man, probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that naturally commanded attention. I'd been introduced to him briefly before the ceremony, a quick handshake and a polite hello. He seemed nice enough, if a bit formal. He wasn't smiling now. The room gradually quieted as people noticed him standing. He had a microphone in his hand, the one that had been used for toasts earlier. His eyes were fixed on my aunt with an intensity that made even me uncomfortable, and I wasn't the target. He began speaking, his voice calm, but carrying easily across the room. He said he'd planned to keep quiet today, to let this be a celebration without complications. But hearing someone mock family at his daughter's wedding had changed his mind. There were some things, he said, that needed to be brought into the light. My aunt's smile had frozen on her face. She tried to wave him off, suggesting he save his speech for later, but he continued as if she hadn't spoken. He talked about secrets, about how families sometimes built themselves on foundations of lies and selective memory. His daughter, the bride, was shifting uncomfortably at the head table, clearly confused about where this was going. The groom looked concerned, leaning over to whisper something to her. Then the bride's father said my aunt's name and asked her if she remembered the summer of 1993. The change in her expression was immediate. The blood drained from her face, and she stood up abruptly, knocking her wine glass over. Red liquid spread across the white tablecloth like a wound. She told him to stop, her voice sharp and desperate in a way I'd never heard before. He didn't stop. He explained that in 1993, my aunt had been working as a manager at a small family-owned business. His family's business, actually. His younger brother had owned it, a modest but profitable printing company that had been in their family for 2 generations. My aunt had been hired because she was dating his nephew at the time, the man who would eventually become my uncle, and they'd wanted to give her a chance. Over the course of 18 months, she'd systematically embezzled nearly $200,000. The room erupted. People were talking over each other, some demanding proof, others telling him to sit down and stop ruining the wedding. My aunt was shouting that he was insane, that this was slander, that she'd sue him for defamation. My uncle, her husband, looked completely blindsided, staring at her with his mouth open. The bride's father remained calm. He pulled out his phone and said he had documentation if anyone wanted to see it. Bank records, forged signatures, emails from the private investigator his family had hired at the time. They discovered the theft right before it would have bankrupted the business. My aunt had covered her tracks well, but not perfectly. Someone asked why they'd never pressed charges. He explained that his brother had been in poor health, and the stress of a court case and public scandal would have likely killed him. My aunt had known this. She'd used it as leverage, threatening to drag everything through the courts for years if they tried to prosecute. She'd offered to pay it back in installments if they stayed quiet. She'd never paid back a cent. His brother had died 6 years later. The family had sold the business shortly after, unable to recover from the financial blow. His nephew, my uncle, had married my aunt not knowing any of this. The family had kept quiet because they'd made a promise to the dying man that they'd avoid a scandal that would tear apart his nephew's future marriage. But that promise, the bride's father said, didn't extend to watching her mock and belittle other people at his daughter's wedding. My aunt tried to leave. She grabbed her purse and headed for the exit, but my uncle caught her arm, demanding to know if it was true. She jerked away from him, and the look on her face told everyone in the room everything they needed to know. The exodus started slowly. The bride's father's siblings and their family stood up first, offering quick apologies to the bride and groom before walking out. They'd apparently been waiting years for permission to cut ties. Then some of my own extended family began standing, distant cousins and great-aunts who'd always looked up to my aunt, their faces twisted with betrayal and disgust. My uncle just sat there, staring at nothing. His kids, my cousins including the bride, looked shattered. The bride was crying, her makeup running, while her new husband tried to comfort her. The wedding they'd spent months planning was disintegrating in real time. My aunt made one last attempt to control the situation. She announced loudly that they were all overreacting, that this was ancient history and irrelevant. She turned to me, perhaps looking for the easiest target to redirect anger toward, and started to say something about how at least she'd never been a failure like some people. My uncle finally spoke up. He told her to shut up, his voice so cold and final that she actually stopped mid-sentence. He stood, removed his wedding ring, and placed it deliberately on the table in front of her. Then he walked out without another word. The room had gone silent again. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. I stayed in my seat, processing everything. The aunt who'd made my life miserable at every family function, who'd used her apparent success as a weapon against anyone she deemed lesser, had built her entire comfortable life on stolen money and lies. The house she'd bragged about, the cars, the expensive colleges for her kids, her husband's business investments that she'd supposedly supported with her savings. All of it traced back to money that had never been hers. The bride's father caught my eye. He gave me a small nod, almost apologetic, before sitting down. The DJ, sensing that normal celebration was impossible, kept the music off. Gradually, people began gathering their things and leaving, offering awkward condolences to the bride and groom on their way out. I approached the head table before leaving. The bride looked up at me with red eyes, and I told her I was sorry her day had been ruined. She shook her head and said it wasn't ruined, not really. She'd rather know the truth about people than build a marriage on comfortable lies. Her father had made a choice, and while she wished the timing had been different, she understood why he'd done it. Her father explained that he'd watched me over the years at various family events. He'd noticed how my aunt treated me, the casual cruelty, and tonight had been the final straw. He'd carried the truth about her for decades, and hearing her publicly humiliate someone at his daughter's wedding had made him realize that silence was its own form of cruelty. I thanked him, not quite sure what else to say, and left. Update 1. The fallout was immediate and brutal. By the next morning, the story had spread through the entire extended family. My phone was flooded with messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, everyone wanting details, or offering their own stories about times my aunt had been cruel or suspicious. My uncle filed for divorce within the week. He'd apparently hired a lawyer that very next morning and had started digging into their finances. Turned out my aunt had been hiding other things too. Nothing as dramatic as the original embezzlement, but enough small deceptions about money that the complete picture painted someone who'd never stopped being comfortable with dishonesty. My cousins were split. The bride, after her initial shock, seemed almost relieved. She told me later that she'd always felt something was off about her mother, some disconnect between the person her mother presented to the world and the person behind closed doors. Having an explanation, even a terrible one, was somehow better than the constant doubt. Her siblings were less forgiving, not toward their mother, but toward the bride's father-in-law for ruining the wedding. One of my cousins stopped speaking to me entirely, as if I'd somehow orchestrated the whole revelation. The youngest is in therapy, trying to process the fact that her entire childhood was funded by stolen money. My aunt tried to do damage control. She posted on social media about being victimized by ancient grudges and how some people couldn't let go of the past. She framed herself as someone who'd made a single mistake decades ago and was being crucified for it. The comments section became a battlefield, with some family members defending her and others sharing their own stories of her cruelty over the years. The bride's father sent me copies of the documentation he'd mentioned. I spent a full evening reading through bank statements and investigator reports from the 90s, seeing in black and white exactly how methodical the theft had been. It wasn't a moment of weakness or a single bad decision. It had been calculated, sustained, and completely intentional. My uncle moved out of their house and is staying with his brother. He told me during a brief phone call that he feels like he never really knew the person he was married to. 30 years of marriage, and he's questioning every memory, every decision, wondering what was real and what was manipulation. The thing that stuck with me most was something the bride said during a follow-up conversation. She mentioned that her father had struggled with the decision to speak up for weeks before the wedding. He'd known it would cause chaos, but he'd also reached a point where staying silent felt like endorsing my aunt's behavior. Sometimes, she said, burning everything down is the only way to build something honest. Update 2. It's been 3 months since the wedding. The family has effectively split into factions. About half have cut off contact with my aunt entirely. The other half maintains some relationship with her, though even they admit things are strained. My aunt eventually took down her social media accounts after the posts defending her generated more criticism than support. She's moved into a small apartment in a different part of the city. From what I hear through the family grapevine, she's working a basic administrative job, nothing like the comfortable life she'd maintained before. The divorce is proceeding. My uncle discovered during the legal process that my aunt had taken out credit cards in his name without telling him and had racked up significant debt. She'd been paying minimums for years, and he'd had no idea. His lawyer is arguing that she should be responsible for all of it, but it's complicated. The bride's father reached out to me last month. He wanted to check in and make sure I was handling everything okay. We met for coffee, and he explained more about his decision to speak up. He said that for years, he'd watched my aunt hurt people, and he'd stayed quiet because of his promise to his late brother. But promises made to protect families shouldn't extend to protecting abusers, and that's what he'd finally realized my aunt was. He'd seen her target me specifically at multiple family events over the years. He'd noticed how other family members either participated or stayed silent, and how isolated that made me. When she'd made that comment at the wedding, he'd thought about his own daughter, about what kind of family environment he wanted her to grow up in, and he'd made a choice. I told him I didn't know whether to thank him or resent him for putting me at the center of such a massive family explosion. He said that was fair, and that he'd understand if I blamed him. But he didn't regret it. The bride and groom are doing well, apparently. They cut their honeymoon short to deal with the immediate fallout, but they've since taken a makeup trip. She told me that the wedding might have ended in disaster, but the marriage itself feels stronger because it started with absolute honesty. No polite fictions, no family secrets lurking in the background. As for me, I found myself in a strange position. Relatives who used to barely acknowledge me now go out of their way to include me in gatherings. Some of it feels genuine, people who are genuinely sorry they didn't stand up for me before. Some of it feels like guilt, or like they're trying to signal which side of the family split they're on. I've started seeing a therapist to work through my own feelings about everything. Years of being treated as lesser by my aunt did more damage than I'd admitted to myself. Having her exposed doesn't automatically heal those wounds, but it's a start. The last time I saw my uncle, he looked 10 years older, but somehow lighter. He said that discovering the truth about his wife had been devastating, but living with the lie would have been worse. He's selling the house and planning to travel, something he'd apparently always wanted to do, but my aunt had discouraged. My aunt sent me a message 2 weeks ago. Just a text, asking if we could talk. I didn't respond. I don't know if I ever will. Part of me wants to hear what she'd say, what excuse or apology she might offer. But a larger part knows that nothing she says will change what happened or who she chose to be for all those years. The bride's father was right about one thing. Sometimes burning everything down is the only way to build something honest. The family I knew doesn't exist anymore. But maybe the one that's forming in its place, fractured and messy as it is, has a chance to be better. I still think about that wedding, about that moment when my aunt's carefully constructed world started collapsing, about the look on her face when she realized she'd finally pushed too far, about the half-empty reception hall as people walked out. I never wanted to go to that wedding. Now I can't imagine what my life would look like if I hadn't.